welcome back. As promised, here is October's video. Today, we shall be talking about what all news stations, newspapers, and crappy psychologists appear to be talking about recently. Violence in video games. And already now I shall tell you what side I have taken. Because as without solid evidence, you have nothing. So I am going to be on the side that is supported by research, regardless of what I myself think. Totally. So now, for a neutral analysis of modern arguments for and against, whether there is a correlation, and whether this correlation is causal or not. First of all, I'd like to debunk any non sequitur arguments given by major news networks such as Fox. Their argument goes that because these mass murderers played games, therefore they must have become violent and inspired by these games. You know, as opposed to living in a country with barely any gun control. I mean, how else are they gonna rack up those 10,000 or so gun crimes a year, as compared to like 10 in the UK? So there must be a correlation, right? No, it's merely them pointing out one thing that they had in common. But two can play that game. How about this? All of these shooters watched many violent films in their spare time. So violent films are to blame. Oh, wait, how about this one? Fact! All mass murderers drink water. Therefore water causes mass murderers, right? Well, no. But you can see how the non sequitur works in this situation. They run the silly assumption that because one variable is true, the other must also be, even when there's no proof for the connection. But then again, people can be so unbelievably stupid and listen to anything, such as the now very relevant dihydrogen monoxide hoax, whereby calling water by an unfamiliar name, that's dihydrogen monoxide by the way, if you didn't know, and listing the bad effects like, it's called hydroxyl acid, the substance in major components of acid rain, and fatal if inhaled. They get people to agree in their stupidity, and in his efforts also coined the term zonerism, referring to the use of a true fact to lead a scientifically and mathematically ignorant public to false conclusions. Which is exactly what Fox likes to do. That aside, what is much more likely is that psychopaths are drawn to specific games and not inspired by them. One thing to be taken into consideration is the fact that almost 50% of all US men aged 13 to 49 play games. The same in the UK. So it comes to no surprise that most of the shooters will be gamers, considering their most often young age and location. I can name several shooters who played no games whatsoever, like Michael Ryan, Derek Bird, George Hennard, Jively Wong, James Egan Holmes, all from different Rampage massacres. Look them up on Wikipedia for further details. Of course, most of these are older men. However, Robert Steenhauser shot and killed 16 people and had no ties to games. The same goes for Wellington Menzies, De Oliveira, and Matt Giovannisari, which were all young men that carried out school shootings with no ties to video games. So this proves that it's not a causal link, right? Well, I'm just gonna go away and... Well, not entirely. The problem is that, since most of these fuckers blew their faces off before we got to them, we can for the most part not ask them in person for their motif. Breivik, however, is still alive and said that he used Call of Duty with a holographic device to gain target acquisition. Now, hold up. This does in no way mean that he was inspired by games, as he himself stated that he used them as practice for a plan that he had already set in motion. Ergo, the games did not cause him to be the crazed maniac he is now, but rather he was drawn to them because they represented the act he wished to commit. I think that he must have always been a crazed maniac, really. But considering his favorite game was World of Warcraft, I'm fairly certain that fantasy violence is not going to inspire gun-based mass murder. And the people who think it could are morons. Everyone in the UK and USA and everywhere else for that matter, spare North Korea maybe, are playing blame games, scapegoating video games for no reason. Like people did before with comics, radio, cinema, film, TV, etc. We are creating a new thing to blame even when we have always had massacres, murders, rampages, and unprovocated sets of violence. In general, as far back in history as we have records. And since nothing has changed really, it quite clearly means that there isn't strictly speaking a correlation from a statistical standpoint. Now, a reasonable deduction that could be made if games actually induce violence, such as this, would be to compare the numbers of people who play games and the number of crimes over a set number of years. We know that the number of crimes have been decreasing steadily over the past few years, and games have become even more violent and prevalent in modern-day society. Here's a graph that TotalBiscuit used to demonstrate a simple fallacy. The fallacy being that here in the graph it appears that since games are becoming more violent and crime is going down, therefore violent video games decrease crime, which is a fallacy. The point being that there is no causal link. Remember, kids, correlation does not necessarily mean causation! And just to further reinstate how there is little to no correlation between game consumptions and homicides, here's another graph. And you can clearly see that there is no correlation even. The results appear to be all over the board. And with that, I say good day, but wait, I have more things to talk about. And during this entire blame game ruckus, after all of these shootings, we have a simple statement from the FBI in their research on the conditions surrounding most shooters. It appears that for the most part, these shooters will have taken inspiration from literature and poems, and in general being in a bad position socially. The FBI states, "The largest group of school shooters exhibited an interest in violence in their own writings, such as poems, essays, or journal entries. In addition, most of the young juvenile shooters are people most often not well received by their circles. They were usually the outcast, bullied loner. Therefore, in most cases, these shootings occur as a vendetta. If not, then it is usually because that person has some form of psychopathy, or is just insane in general." We cannot simply say that games drove them to the violence when we know that they had problems before any game addiction. This needs to be researched in depth and not just breezed over to scapegoat one thing. It's debated that game addiction occurs as a result of their problems and not causing the problem. Blaming games is therefore not blaming the cause or source, it is instead blaming a side detail brought about by an already existing condition. It's like trying to blame Christianity for Hitler, even when Christianity isn't what made Hitler the man he was. The man was insane and killed millions because he was insane. No other reason. And no, the fact that he failed admission to an art school by a Jewish representative has little to nothing to do with either. But we can always speculate, right? While I'm not denying that violent games may possibly have a maladaptive effect on certain individuals, for the majority of the time this is actually not the case, and if it is, for the most part it will be due to major frustration and not actual game content in question. Give a person an extremely frustrating and difficult game featuring no violence, and I'm certain you will observe the fact that they will be more hostile and irritable for a short while after playing. And for anyone talking about the fact that young children are playing these games, the simple answer is that, well, they shouldn't be. But their oblivious parents couldn't give a shit, nor do they stand up to peer pressure. It runs along, "All my friends have it, and I will be the sure thumb of the class should I not get this hyper-violent game called GTA 5, says the 5-year-old. This is not right. The age ratings are there for a reason. However, this doesn't mean that parents cannot buy these games for their children if they deem them to be mature enough. But for the most part, they exist as guidelines towards purchases that can be overruled if given consent by a parental figure. There are family settings on all consoles for this very reason, so parents can regulate what their children play. Studies also suggest that this is the case for most parents as well. What I'm saying is that any campaign to ban violent games can go f*** itself. Because rather than forcing everyone to not have a particular media because you don't like it, just restrict those games to your own children. Educate people to use parental restriction and family settings and so on. These people trying to push this ideal are like people saying that because we don't like it, no one can have it. Which is dumb in all ways imaginable. Their reasoning works along this kind of analogy. Banning violent video games in an attempt to stop violent crimes and murder is like trying to give a patient antibiotics for a viral infection. It won't work, and the recipient will be really annoyed by the fact that they have now contracted MRSA because of a small, particularly resistant strain of bacteria that happened to be in their system and survives the antibiotics, when there is no real danger, instead it multiplies rapidly, resulting in the death of the patient. Okay, maybe not that severe. Haha. Now I shall discuss the results from actual scientific studies done by respectable societies with reasonable sample sizes. What I mean is that case studies are not reliable because we can only really speculate most of the motifs of the killers as well as determine other confounding variables and etc. Now, the earliest studies done on the topic were done in the early 1990s, and actually the majority of these studies that were done showed an increase in violent behavior. However, in most of these studies, the actual extent to which it was greater was never discussed fully. In addition, the measurements that they took were for the most part unquantifiable and were done on anecdotal evidence. Also meaning that they could very well be cherry-picked to fit their own hypotheses, which I know many psychologists have done and do on numerous different occasions. Just like any other form of uncertain topics, just to prove to themselves that they are, right. Of course, I'm not saying that most psychologists do this, I'm just saying that there are always a very small minority of bad apples, shall we say, most which will still publish valid research. Because of this, and the fact that the studies were not proper blind studies, there is no actual way to validate the results, as we cannot know if the interpretations were biased, nor can we know if the players of the violent video games were acting more violent simply to please the experimenters exhibiting demand characteristics, or because the violent game group had more difficult and frustrating games than the non-violent control group. Since most of these studies were done on boys, this is very likely to be the case. But we cannot null hypothesis the studies just because of this. They are still reasonable studies to relate to, but as a general rule of thumb, newer studies are going to be more valid and reliable because of the increased experience within the field and increased knowledge, as well as better laboratory and experimental practice. But either way, first we shall discuss the first meta-analysis on the subject done in 2001 by Anderson and Bushman, which indeed found that combining the results of empirical studies of violent video game effects on 5 types of outcome variables, aggressive behavior, aggressive cognition, aggressive effect, helping behavior, and psychological arousal, they found significant effects of violent video games on each of the 5 variables. Exposure to video games increases aggressive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, increases arousal, and decreases helping behavior. What may be noted is the fact that these results may actually be exaggerated by the researchers, which has been suggested multiple times by different institutes. Not that I know how to quantify those scales, but they seem very insignificant, really. However, this meta-analysis was done on 5 or so studies made already prior during the 1990s, all of which used anecdotal evidence and relatively small sample sizes, meaning that they would be incredibly prone to either experimental bias or demand characteristics. In addition, most were performed on game systems which had not yet developed any realistic depiction of violence. The worst they had was Mortal Kombat, which is very tame compared to some of the things we have today. While I understand the general gist and imagery depicted are meant to represent and portray realistic violence, the lack of serious realism during the time of these studies make the violence expressed in the games have less of an impact, as desensitization cannot occur to the same extent unless the medium skewers the line between game and reality, and may therefore be more irrelevant to the following behavior patterns. The medium and type of game would also affect whereby competitive games would instill more frustration and irritation than, e.g., relaxing puzzle games, meaning that the notion of time, competition, and pacing would drive individuals differently, not the violence itself. Of course, this is just a theory on my part. I'm not suggesting I'm correct, but please discuss. Seriously, the comments are open to any intelligent discussion, so go say something, please. The studies done by self-interpretation surveys suffer from the same problems whereby questions could be leading towards specific answers, even when explicitly made not to be leading. An individual male who plays video games and is asked such a questionnaire may answer it in the way he is expected to as opposed to what he himself thinks. The same going for one who does not play violent games. This again is a form of demand characteristics that are portrayed through associative learning, whereby individuals will expect responses to follow a trend based upon earlier responses, such as, yes, I play violent video games, and therefore will fulfill what they expect the researchers wanted. Of course, we cannot assume too much, as the results may be completely valid for the groups tested on and for the type of violence tested. For the most part, in the studies in the meta-analysis, this was violence against inanimate objects as well as helpfulness to other people. but never actually any violent expression towards people, meaning that it cannot be used to actually validate behavior towards other human beings, making them extremely lacking. Now onto a more positive note. A recent study done in 2013 by Christopher Ferguson and Cheryl Olson show the complete opposite effect as previously suggested by the psychological department regarding high-risk individuals, i.e. children with ADHD and chronic depression. Such conditions usually found associated with mass murderers. You know, when they happen in one person per every, billion. In this study, a sample size of 377 American children with an average age of 13 from various ethnic groups, all with different degrees of either ADHD or depression, which by the way is a great start to a study, there should be little to no class and race bias, there's a great variety in individuals, and anomalies would do little to affect the study with such a large sample. Now, this is the great part. As opposed to finding minimal correlations, the researchers found no association between the playing of violent video games and subsequent increased delinquent criminality or bullying in children with either clinically elevated depressive or attention deficit symptoms, which appears to be in line with the more recent Secret Service report, in which the occurrence of more general forms of youth violence were linked with aggressiveness and stress rather than with video game violence. In addition to the slightly more dated Secret Service study on actual school shooters, where they found that out of 41 individuals, only 12% were attracted to violent video games, while 24% read violent books and 27% were attracted to violent films. In fact, it might even just be a good idea to skim over the study references section on the Wikipedia page of video game controversies. Now, that's all fine and dandy, so we're done. Games don't cause violence. What? You thought I was gonna let her off that easily? Of course not! Now, there's a problem with the study on high-risk individuals. While the sample size and appropriateness is perfect, the fact that the researchers support the idea that games don't cause violence means that there is a chance that their study suffers from experimental bias, which could be the case for any study really. However, they said themselves that Ferguson and Olson warned that the results could not be generalized to extreme cases such as mass homicides, meaning that there are still individuals that may be affected because of a very simple factor: individual differences. Individual differences mean that some things don't float everyone's boat, and just for the sake of argument, I will quote Ferguson on their statement regarding silly news networks jumping the blame wagon because these mass shooters played games. Statistically speaking, it would actually be more unusual if a youth delinquent or shooter did not play violent video games, given that the majority of youth and young men play such games at least occasionally. Meaning that this suggested link is nothing more than a huge steaming pile of bullshit. And yes, I can have that opinion. Haha. However, not all analysis is true or relevant. I would be greatly mindful of people attempting to put forward this kind of thing as a sole piece of evidence, because as we should all know since primary school, that correlation does not necessarily mean causation, as otherwise you are acting on a fallacy, as I've said before. But I shall include the article in my source list, as the rest was a fairly good read and a good account of it all. In fact, 2013 has been a good year for research into violence and games. In July, an Australian study failed to find a link between games and diminishing prosocial behaviors, testing both modern and classic games, meaning that they redid the 1990s experiments and instead found no effects as opposed to the prior substantial effect. But then again, these are two different cultures. American and Australian youth will have different cultural bases, and therefore it cannot be completely disregarded. But to find no correlation is always significant. The experimental design used does have some faults, because of how difficult it is to assess these kinds of links. It's fair enough. They used self-interpretation formulae, and I have already expressed a problem that may arise either through demand characteristics or the screw you effect. Yes, that is its name. But unlike prior studies discussed, this took into account the difficulty of the games, the frustration and arousal. In addition, the study was a definitive blind study, as multiple conditions were tested by separate scientists, so the control and dependent stages of the experiments were kept separate as two studies. The resulting final helpfulness test, whereby the experimenter would appear to accidentally drop some documents and pens on the floor to see if the candidate would help just after the survey is finished, clearly shows that there is no correlation in this study, as shown by the image. And, as the different experiments go on, time and time again, more of the people who played the violent games helped more than those who played the non-violent games, which is odd, but still, you can read the article yourself, it'll be in the description. But this one study is by no means definitive, but it's surely an interesting contrast to the earlier 1990s studies. And for the sake of argument, I shall include numerous more studies in the description, not mentioned as well. Now, after all that, what have I proven? Nothing, really. I have spoken about different studies, old and new, and about what they've attempted to show from what violent video games could do to a person, and even after all that delegation, the only thing I can really confirm is that they do not cause mass shootings, and anyone who thinks that they do, or that there is a link, is a moron. Mass murderers have been around since way before video games. The thing is that with the internet, most of these are heard of immediately and are well documented. The perpetrator's name, his victim's number, instead of name, that's to dehumanize the victims, leading to the creating of an anti-hero, with the numbers as a record to beat. A sick role model for people who have issues. In addition to allowing rosy retrospection as more documentation means more awareness, I know that I am but quoting the biscuit, the Total Biscuit, but I feel it relevant to discuss it further. However, one thing that may be of a lesser issue is desensitization towards violence. While for the most part, people can discern between reality and fiction, and therefore still maintain a realistic image of the real world, therefore not letting violent games escapades let loose on their senses when leaving the virtual world. The problem is that violence may be desensitized so that people will react with lesser signals, e.g. lower heart rate. But desensitization does not often lead to violence, as moral high grounds are still cemented to most individuals. Many studies have been done on this, and for the most part it is true that continuous exposure to any violent media, like news, films, games, etc., can lead to desensitization, to which simulated or videoed violence no longer produces an equally strong emotional response. Now, it is debatable whether this desensitization is of any actual relevance to the real-life situations, as I said before about the difference between simulated violence and the real deal. Now, I would argue that this desensitization, if it translates into the real world, may actually cause people to be able to handle violent situations easier, as they'll be able to experience less of a fight-or-flight response that could act with more rationale as opposed to primitive instincts. However, situations of dangers are different to violence, and I deem the response to having a gun or knife pointed your direction would still instill the same response. But it may mean that passively observing a violent scene may lessen or prevent helpful intents due to lack of an emotional response. But some of the studies I've spoken about today concluded that they would be more helpful, while others concluded that they'd be less helpful. But as I said before, the real deal may well mean that people would still act differently to what any laboratory study says. And with this, I shall make a conclusion to this discussion. While in modern society, the effects of violent games are extremely debatable, as no solid evidence is likely to be found for a very long time, due to the way that we attempt to quantify, measure, and assess the variables. Since it is actually impossible to properly quantify the response, it is, and will remain, very difficult to conclude anything on. There is sure to be some form of effect from playing games. Some definitive answers found include things like improved hand-to-eye coordination, as well as increased problem-solving abilities. Whether or not desensitization has any actual effect on the action of humans is yet to be discovered. What I can attempt to justify a confirmation on is the fact that games do not cause mass murders, nor do they inspire them. And now, for my short opinion on the whole. I believe that games do not desensitize the majority of its audiences in any maladaptive way, nor do I believe that it promotes violence or causes violent crimes and or murders, though I believe that there may be some, very few select individuals that could be affected badly by any violent media, not just specific to just games. But I believe that for the most part games have no discernible correlation to violence, and I don't think violent games should be banned. I do think that we need to educate parents enough for them to realize that some games are not for young children. Games like GTA 5 should be reserved for mature audiences only. Learn to make that judgment, parents. And with that, I shall be off. Hope you enjoyed this discussion. I hope it was of some thoughtful consideration. And as always, I implore you to discuss it further in the comments. Suggest studies for consideration, discuss alternate ideas, and please don't be afraid to disagree. Thank you for listening. See you next time.